Thank you for the invitation. I am happy to have the opportunity to give this lecture and discuss our results in this environment. Today I will present some results from our research project, which focuses very generally on gender in a mathematical cluster of excellence. And I framed this lecture with a question, the question whether there are old barriers or new changes regarding gender in mathematics. And before I start presenting our results, I'd like to introduce our project by giving an overview on our overall research questions and our theoretical foundation, the research context, and the methods we have used to collect and analyze our data. In our sociological research project, we are looking at causes and mechanisms of the reproduction of gender disparities in mathematics and their existence in that mathematical cluster of excellence. Therefore, we are interested in the possibilities and conditions for successful status transitions in the cluster. For example, do early career researchers succeed to develop the necessary career knowledge? We are also looking at the interrelations between leaving academia and disciplinary or organizational exclusion with a specific focus on gatekeeping. Here we are, for example, interested in the existence of unconscious biases or gender stereotypes on side of the gatekeepers, in our case, scientists in leadership position in the cluster. Are there stereotypes? Where do these stereotypes become apparent, for example, in recruitment or support? And this is also the focus of today's presentation, and I will further talk about the relevancy of gatekeeping later. And last but not least, we are also interested in the structures and cultures of the cluster as an excellent research environment and its effects on gender relation. Our research is based on a social constructivist and interactional perspective. These perspectives are supplemented by field theoretical considerations according to Bourdieu. That means in a nutshell that we understand gender as a social construct and the gender relations and the inequalities embedded therein, not only as structurally predetermined. Doing gender means that gender relations are constantly being reproduced in interactions, such as supervisions or recruitment situations, as shown in the circle above. Subjects and their interpretations and actions are thus central to the reproduction of gender disparities. However, this does not happen on a lonely island or in a vacuum, but in a hierarchical field that is already gendered. And this is where field theory provides a good addition. Bourdieu sees science as a field with its own rules and power dynamics. One rule of the game, that is what he calls it, is, for example, to get to the top through merit. That means to obtain formal qualifications or titles for the scientific field. Being good, however, requires external recognition. It is not enough that you have the needed grades and qualifications to be recognized. However, research has shown that it is not only merit, that means the formal qualification or quality of the research that plays a role. And here I am referring to a study from Buffet about how scientists are made. Also other things, such as motivation or professional enthusiasm and dedication, play a role. The demonstration of the so-called scientific habitus, for example by showing motivation, promotes recognition as a scientist. Also, the position of the actors in the field is a relevant factor. It goes with differences in power to get and give recognition. This means that one's own scientific achievement must not only be evaluated as relevant in terms of content or qualification, and one must demonstrate that one is serious about it to ride up the elevator, but it must also be seen and be accepted, in the best case by already recognized actors who have more power in the game. And that is a point where the gatekeepers come into the picture. Gatekeepers play an important role in the access to the science system. They decide on the selection of future employees and thus guarantee financial security in the qualification phase. They provide access to work areas and existing support structures and supervise and evaluate qualification processes. I presented in mathematical settings where there was also criticism of the use of the term gatekeeper. It was criticized that the term has a very negative connotation of someone like deliberately and maliciously excluding women from science. However, this is not what the term gatekeeping means in the sociological sense. The term describes positions of power and therefore shed light on power relations that can have exclusionary effects, even if not intended or unconscious. So whether they want it or not, scientists in leadership positions have the power to shape the future of early career researchers, and the early career researchers depend on them. Therefore, the term gatekeeper is also intended to draw attention to this responsibility. So based on all these considerations I introduced, we take a multidimensional perspective on gender disparities in mathematics. The methodological focus of the project is on the interpretation and actions of the subjects using qualitative interviews, on the context and discursive conditions of the scientific fields, such as ideas about the scientific system, gender stereotypes, and the interrelations between all of them. And I already said a lot about the gatekeepers, and I will further address their perspectives when I come to our results. But before, I like to draw the attention to the context or field of our study. What are the specifics of the context we are looking at? The research context of our study is a cross-institutional mathematical cluster financed by the DFG Excellence Initiative. The cluster includes the mathematical departments of 3 universities, including their work areas, as well as 2 other non-university research institutions with a mathematical focus, and it has its own graduate school. There are different cornerstones, namely research and career development, with the aim to establish the cluster as an excellent environment and connect local mathematical talents, as well as recruit international excellent students and scientists of all career stages. The research area is structured into 2 years postdoc positions and 3 years PhD positions, and these research projects are selected internally. The research projects are led by the scientists we interviewed. These scientists do not only lead research projects and recruit PhD students and postdocs for these projects and supervise qualification theses, they also sit on various committees, for example, the selection committees for students of the graduate school. The graduate school also provides additional recruitment of students who are supervised by the scientist in leadership position and sometimes employed in the research projects. Moreover, in the area of career development, career or networking events or funding is provided. Besides research and career development, equal opportunities is an important cornerstone of the cluster's image. It is a declared goal to increase the proportion of female mathematicians within the cluster, but also in mathematics in general. For this purpose, the cluster has launched numerous equality measures to help improve the situation and opportunities for women in science. The graduate school has implemented a gender-sensitive process in the selection of students. Moreover, there are different funding and networking opportunities addressed to women. Also, our project is one of these measures. We are therefore examining a context that combines excellent research with a claim to equality. It is therefore fair to say that the conditions in the cluster initially appear to be beneficial to women's careers. So, I could end my presentation here by concluding effective new changes have been made and the situation has improved. But even though the cluster really tried and is still trying to establish a culture of equality, gender disparities are still existent. So, if it is not the structure, then where are the barriers? What we are looking at today is the research area and the conditions of project recruitment and support within the work areas, and I will also take a closer look at the area where the change is supposed to be initiated, equal opportunity. So what have we done? There were 2 data collection phases. In the first phase, we interviewed scientists in leadership position, and in the second phase, we interviewed PhD students and postdocs. The results I will present today are based on 45 semi-structured interviews with scientists in leadership position. That means PIs, AIs, and co-AIs in research projects in the cluster. Not all of them were professors, some had permanent positions or were postdocs and junior research group leaders. We interviewed 29 men and 16 women. The interviews were conducted in German and in English. For the purpose of this presentation, I also translated the German quotes. I'd like to mention one thing about the whole sampling process. There was a really high response rate from the selected scientists in leadership position. We asked 49 scientists and 45 gave us an interview. And just to give you something to compare, as I already said, the PhD students and postdocs are not in the focus of today's lecture, but we contacted 232 PhD students and postdocs and only 20 gave us an interview. Out of 20, only 7 were women, and I addressed 4 of these women personally to give me an interview. No diverse person answered our call. So it is kind of remarkable that there seems to be a difference in interest or commitment to provide insight for our research, which was advertised by the cluster board on different occasions. We conducted semi-structured interviews, and in the interviews we addressed different topics. For example, we asked for the scientists' career biographies, we asked for practices of and criteria for recruitment, especially recruitment of PhD students and postdocs for projects positions, and if applicable, also experiences with recruitment for the graduate school. We were interested in so-called cultures of recognition and support. So how do the gatekeepers support the early career researchers, for example, in their work areas? We were also asking for career knowledge, what is important to know to become a professor, ideas of excellence, especially what it needs to be or become a successful scientist or mathematician. And we ask for opportunities and risks of academic or scientific careers. And moreover, we're interested in career motivation. So what do the gatekeepers think? Why people leave? Why people stay? Last but not least, we were also interested in the specifics of the cluster and the mathematical subject cultures. So for the overtopics, we defined subtopics, and for these subtopics, we asked open questions. That means that due to qualitative research logic, the interviewees were free to choose their focus within these thematic guidelines and therefore establish important aspects according to their relevancy. Gender was a cross-cutting theme here. That means we ask in all thematic blocks about gender-specific aspects, for example, the relevancy of equal opportunities for recruitment or assumed differences between men, for example, when it comes to risks of a scientific career. To determine important aspects of our research and to develop the interview topics, we have used the findings from previous studies on gender disparities, gatekeeping and careers in science in general and in mathematics in particular. The material was coded using standard methods for qualitative analysis, which is called content analysis, and we used a computer program called MaxQDA to support our coding. Our goal was to identify cross-interview patterns of action and interpretation that may reinforce gender disparities. Thus, the focus here is not on frequencies. And we followed an open approach. That means we had assumptions in mind, but were open to new insights. I will now start with our findings by looking at the perspectives of gatekeepers on female and male PhD students and postdocs. We found gendered stereotypes about future PhD students and postdocs on site of these scientists in leadership position. I have illustrated them with original quotes from the interviews, and I will continue providing original quotes to exemplify my points throughout the whole presentation. So, we have found 3 patterns of interpretation independently of the gatekeeper's own gender. That means male and female scientists in leadership positions share these perspectives. First, the assumption that female early career researchers have less career motivation than male early career researchers. Second, the ascription that female early career researchers still have, and more importantly, want to have main care responsibility. And third, the ascriptions that female early career researchers and male early career researchers differ in their personality traits. The first two ascriptions are deeply interrelated. The gatekeepers explain the lower career motivation with the need for security or less risk tolerance and closely connect these ascriptions to the priority of private life for women. In this context, they question women's self-sacrifice for science. However, turning to the family and thus not pursuing a career in academia is not interpreted as a structural problem or as a problem of academic culture and its demands, for example, constant availability or the need to be a 24/7 scientist, but as an individual decision by the women, and thus as a lack of will or motivation. It is interesting that in this interpretation pattern, it still does not seem possible to have both a family and an academic career. Both ascriptions are also seen as the main motives for women for leaving science. Moreover, women are characterized by both male and female gatekeepers as rather insecure, reluctant, and silent. Male PhD students and postdocs, on the other hand, are perceived as outstanding and self-confident. It is noteworthy that the characteristics ascribed to male PhD students and postdocs are sometimes even connoted negatively by the gatekeepers, while women with their need for security and a certain restraint with regard to a career in academia are even interpreted as being smarter and more rational. So, what is problematic about these ascriptions? To answer this question, I'd like to introduce the image of the potentially successful scientist or mathematician. In the interviews, we ask about criteria for success and barriers for a career in science or academia. In this thematic fields, beliefs and attributions about what a successful scientist should be like became relevant. And we found 4 characteristics or preconditions which form a powerful pattern of interpretation of who is potentially successful in the scientific or academic system. The potentially successful scientist needs a specific personality, which is risk-taking, self-promoting, and self-confident. Life circumstances, which are free of barriers. This is seen as a basic requirement to be totally committed to science and its demands. In this regard, both female and male gatekeepers see childcare as a main barrier in the science system. Third, mathematical ways of thinking and acting, that means problem-solving skills, logical skills, or precision. And fourth, an intrinsic or inner motivation, which is mainly revealed by a kind of urge to sacrifice oneself completely to science. So, independently of their own gender, gatekeepers recall an ideal scientific personality. This potentially successful scientist lives in complete self-sacrifice and free from external influences, but at the same time without any interest in security. So if we think back to the previous slide, men are considered to be more risk-taking and self-confident. They have no ascribed care responsibilities, and according to the gatekeepers, they show more enthusiasm and thus are assumed to have a higher inner motivation than women. They therefore are ascribed the qualities and life circumstances required for a career in science. Even though none of the scientists in leadership positions doubt female scientists and their possibilities to reach a professorship directly, on the contrary, we have also found that their chances are rated as very good. Still, when we picture the perspectives on women and men, it is the personality traits and ascribed motivation of male PhDs and postdocs that are connected with this image, whereas association about women's personality traits, motivation, and on their assumed life circumstances do not fit the image of the potentially successful scientist. For female scientists, potential barriers are constituted by the fact that this prevailing image implicitly excludes them from being able and willing to be scientists. What we haven't found, and that is also noteworthy, are no direct or implicit references to gender differences in mathematical talent as such. That means there's no perception that men have mathematical talent or the ability of logical thinking and women do not. Given a history in which women have been denied such fundamental skills, this can certainly be seen as a positive aspect. But it is also important to keep in mind that we are talking about a cluster of excellence here. This means that everyone who is here has already proven that they are skilled mathematicians. Also, social expectations in the interview situation might have played a role here. So, how do these results actually reinforce gender disparities? Up to now, it is just what people think. Where do these patterns of interpretation might come to practice? And here I brought two practices which are vulnerable for the reproduction of disparities in interrelation with the image of the potentially successful scientists and the gendered stereotypes interwoven with this image. First of all, internal recruitment, and second of all, individual and informal support. Internal recruitment, that means the selection of staff which is already employed or already known to the scientists in leadership position, is common practice in recruitment for project positions, and it is also socially accepted by those who advertise externally. This practice is legitimized by the need to select the right candidates for the project to be successful, which is kind of an external pressure on the scientist in leadership position. Or as one of the respondents says, I have to be on the lookout for an employee who has exactly the right profile, the right prior knowledge, as far as possible, to successfully work on this project. End of quote. Another legitimizing external factor is the responsibility for the successful qualification of the early career researchers. I quote again, you can't in good conscience put someone in a doctoral position who you are not certain will be able to do it. So, what is problematic here? We also found that the lack of fit is the main argument for rejecting women in the recruitment process. And at the same time, what is considered to be a right fit is also based on subjective criteria and subjective interpretation of supposedly objective criteria. So, how do the gatekeepers decide who is a fit, who has exactly the right profile, or who is able to do it? And here I like to go into the data and take a deeper look with you of how the gatekeepers choose who suits the project needs. One of the most important criteria for a good fit is thematic closeness to the project content, which makes perfect sense. But the interviews show that the criterion of thematic fit, or the question of how close is close enough, leaves room for interpretation, for example, for the following scientists. And here I quote, XXX, it's a female scientist, was actually already named in the application. So you could do that. Name the people ad persona. So she fitted in well because she also studied under Professor XXX nearby, but always had an interest in a specific mathematical field and had already learned a lot during her studies and had already partly pursued projects in the direction of not really what we do, but at the interface, let's say between one mathematical field and another mathematical field. That's why she was a great fit. 2 points become clear from this quote. First, women can theoretically benefit from internal recruitment provided they are already known or established in the mathematical community, and I will refer to that issue later. Second, the criterion of fit can be applied in a very flexible manner. In this case, the applicant was only partly a professional fit, but she was considered a good fit because she was already known. And I'd like to introduce another criterion which is used to make a recruitment decision. This professor here gives us a risk assessment along which he decides how a project can be successful. And I quote, when you have a project, you want to carry it out successfully and try to minimize the risks and always look at the excellence of the person. I don't really care whether someone is a woman or a man or whatever. It doesn't interest me, but I try to find out, and here come the criteria of his risk assessment. Is the person behind the project, does she want to do it? Is she good enough to do it? The criterion he uses to estimate whether a project will be successful with this researcher besides excellence, and I will come to that on my next slide, is motivation or dedication. And here I'd like to give you a short reminder. Motivation and dedication for science are characteristics which are mainly associated with men, whereas the gatekeepers assume that women are less motivated. Excellence and quality are other criteria which were named as important to make recruitment decisions. But even the supposedly more objective and formalized criteria, for example measured in grades, offer room for interpretation, or as one respondent said, "For me, someone is not automatically not excellent if he has a 2 or even a 2.3. This is a grade. He will probably be considered less. But if the master thesis shows something innovative, then it can also be excellent." So, if we consider how these professors navigate through the decision process of hiring someone for project positions, it can be seen that subjective criteria are important to make a decision of who can successfully carry out research in the project. And this is not the person with the best formal qualification. Even the supposedly objective criteria are interpretable to find the right person for the project needs. It is no surprise to a sociologist, and it might also be no surprise to you, that subjective criteria are used to make recruitment decisions and that objective criteria are interpretable. But it is important to reflect how these subjective criteria relate to gender. So even though we found that internal recruitment can also favor women who are already known in the system, this recruitment practice reinforced gender inequalities on two levels. First, internal recruitment is particularly problematic when the proportion of women is already low in the work areas. If there are only a few women in the internal selection and the suitably trained or fitting men who have exactly the right profile are selected, it leads to the proportion of women remaining low and no women who have the right profile will be trained. Second, internal recruitment becomes problematic whenever subjective recruitment criteria interrelate with gender stereotypes and contribute to women not being asked for a position internally, because it is, for example, assumed that they are less motivated or dedicated. I'd like to introduce a second mechanism which is vulnerable to gendered gatekeeping: individual support in informal situations. In general, the interviewees see supervision as an important cornerstone of their work. The gatekeepers do not see or do not mention any gender differences in their supervision practices of transferring career knowledge. That means that they think that they talk equally to everyone about the things which are needed to become a professor, for example, the need to publish and network. However, especially in the field of career planning, the gatekeepers indicate that they support women more than men in the decision to pursue a scientific career because they believe that women need to be persuaded. The male interviewees who express the belief that female early career researchers need to be persuaded describe this persuasion as almost crossing a border. This professor here is talking about offering career opportunities to two female scientists he supervised, and he says, "I also had the feeling that I'd probably overpowered them with too much goodwill." We found this pattern to perceive the persuasion of female scientists for a career as border crossing just among male professors. We also found a tendency of externalization of responsibility for the dropout or the difficulties women face in mathematics on part of the interviewees. That means, in short, that some gatekeepers assume that gender disparities in mathematics have nothing to do with themselves or their actions, and that they are not in the position to make any changes. One pattern of interpretation here is that external boundaries, such as the society or in other interviews, the precarious working conditions in the science system, are responsible for the difficulties or the dropout of women. And here again, I give you one example from the interviews. This male professor says, "The social expectations play an essential role in this whole gender aspect." Another common explanation is that it is solely the woman's individual decision to leave academia. This decision has even positive connotations, or as this respondent said, and here I quote again, Most of the female candidates who realize that they are good are very likely to become professors in the present system. Here we can see something which I mentioned before. The chances of women to become professors are rated as very good. He continues, and they somehow know that, but they know that the path is long, complicated, time-consuming, and that the job at the end is not exactly attractive, especially not if you think about the compatibility of family and career. End of the quote. What can be seen is that the gatekeepers here do not reflect their potential contributions to the reproduction of the inequality promoting structural or cultural conditions. Moreover, especially within the pattern of interpretation to see the dropout as an individual decision of women, the structurally more difficult initial circumstances are disregarded. Additionally, they perceive those factors as not changeable and attribute little room for action to themselves. And that is actually something we also have seen in other interviews. The gatekeepers do not mention any connection between an insecurity to pursue a career or lack of motivation on side of women and the support offers they have made or failed to make in this regard that may have reinforced these factors. Up to now, I talked about inequality reproducing mechanisms and practices, which are also known in research about gender in academia. However, the cluster is really trying to make new changes by providing an environment where equal opportunity is seen as important. But unfortunately, what we found is that these new changes hit old barriers. The ways the gatekeepers perceive these changes provide additional challenges, and I will now further elaborate on that. We have reconstructed the perspectives of gatekeepers on equality and equality measures and found problematic elements. At this point, I would like to emphasize two patterns of interpretation to clarify the problem. First, the interpretation that equality measures contradict the merit principle. That means that excellence and the advancement of women are perceived as mutually exclusive. This interpretation is problematic in itself as it implies that women are not equally qualified. It is also well known in studies about the perceptions of equal opportunity. At this point, however, I would like to make a different point. And here I would like to add another interpretation, namely the interpretation that equality is very important and must be implemented. That sounds good at first. This interpretation was shared by those who are really committed to increase the proportion of women. But if we take a closer look, it can be seen that both patterns have underlying problematic traits. And here I'd like to invite you to put yourself in the following situation. You're sitting there in the job interview with a professor and your potential new employer. You find his mathematical research really interesting and you are eager to discuss his research and show your own mathematical skills. And the first thing he says is, "It is so good to have you here because we are always happy when we somehow find a woman." So I hope you get the point of why this is feeling really weird. Both interpretations reproduce a pattern that reduces female mathematicians to their gender, position them as someone who needs to be helped, and not perceive them primarily in terms of their mathematical skills or as mathematicians. What is implied is that women are not naturally mathematicians or scientists like men, and here I'm referring back to this male-connotated image of a successful scientist, but women in the first place, women who now also want to do mathematics. In these patterns of interpretation, the fact that mathematics is a privilege with male connotations is not addressed. That means the existence of the historical inherent inequalities that are still embedded in the system and in the image of a mathematician remain concealed. And at this point, I'd like to give you a quote from an article Susan Dameron wrote in 2008 about the mechanisms that shape gender relations in mathematics, which is still, like more than 15 years later, describing perfectly what is happening here. She said, male mathematical lives are considered as totally outside the social construction of sex-gender roles and relations, while lives of females accomplished in mathematics are presented as totally within them. These perspectives on equal opportunities also have consequences for female PhD students and postdocs. Among the women we interviewed, we found critical to negative perspectives on equal opportunity measures. And here I will give you one example from an interview with a postdoc researcher. And here I quote, "And for me, this was really strange that I could be applying for places who are only for women. And I asked myself then, what will people think? Will they think that I got this position only because I'm a woman and that I need this type of position because otherwise I wouldn't be able to do the same job that a man is able to do?" And if you look at the perspectives of the gatekeepers, she's kind of right with her assessment of the situation. So, for female PhD students and postdoctoral researchers, the prevailing interpretations of equal opportunities also mean that their competencies are called into question. So, what do the findings mean for gender relations in mathematics in general and in the cluster in particular? With reference to the initial question, one can say that besides new changes, we still found old barriers in mathematics in 2024. We found persisting gender stereotypes on side of the gatekeepers. They assume gender differences regarding the career motivation and the ways women and men deal with career conditions. Women are also implicitly perceived as not fitting the image of the successful scientist. These exclusionary ideas of the ideal scientist and its interwovenness with gender stereotypes reinforce gender disparities whenever they interrelate with informal inequality reproducing practices in the field, especially the practice of internal recruitment for project position and its subjective selection criteria, and individual and informal support practices, especially when it comes to encourage female scientists to pursue an academic career. At the same time, the gatekeepers do not reflect their own share in reproducing these exclusionary mechanisms and attribute little room for action to themselves. What we also found is that the establishment of new changes, a culture where equal opportunity is seen as an important goal, is kind of hitting old barriers. The prevailing perceptions of equal opportunity measures among gatekeepers in the cluster reinforce disparities and at the same time lead to a negative perception of these measures among female mathematicians. Neither the image itself, nor the persistence of gender stereotypes or the problematic perspectives on equal opportunities are new phenomena in research on gender disparities and gatekeeping in science in general, and unfortunately, all are still powerful in the cluster. Our results therefore also confirm the results of previous studies for this mathematical cluster. So what can be done now? We are no equal opportunity actors, we are researchers and therefore can provide results and no solutions. But still I would like to highlight the following ideas for addressing and discussing these inequality reproducing mechanisms. It is questionable whether the very widespread practice of internal recruitment itself can be replaced by other recruitment practices in research projects. However, early support of women, for example by hiring female students from the beginning, may increase their chances of being promoted further in such a recruitment environment. Therefore, more awareness for the importance of such early support is needed. Moreover, accompanying additional external and more formalized recruitment practices, for example in graduate schools, and the entrance of female students in the work areas through stipends on that way, may be helpful to make unknown female students known to the gatekeepers, and therefore increase the proportion of women in the internal recruitment pool. This additional recruitment already exists at the cluster, as I mentioned at the beginning, and its long-term effects must be analyzed further. Also implicitly, gendered attributions of potential play a role when they unconsciously guide the decision to address a male mathematician for a position instead of a female mathematician, because it is assumed that they have different priorities or different motivation. Here, a reflection of gender stereotypes and raising awareness on side of gatekeepers, not just in general, but especially in interrelation with the specifics of recruitment for project position and support practices may be helpful. Beyond that, ideas of what a potentially successful scientist is like create barriers. And here I would assume with reference to diversity, not only for female scientists. Therefore, besides support measures and raising awareness, a general discussion about the ideal itself may be necessary. Last but not least, and here we have a point where new changes are kind of bumping into old structures or old barriers. Even though the cluster strives for equality, the way scientists think about the measures provide additional challenges for female mathematicians. The fact that equal opportunity measures are interpreted as betterment, or that women in this context are not seen as scientists, but essentialized as women due to the prevailing interpretations, also makes it necessary to critically address the way we talk about equal opportunities. It seems to be relevant to explain more clearly what equal opportunities actually mean, respectively what it is meant for. That means to address the inequalities that exist beforehand and are still embedded in the system, and that prevent that men and women can start from the same position. This also raises the question of how to achieve equality without emphasizing female mathematicians as women, as it is sometimes feared by the female mathematicians and sometimes done by the gatekeepers, even if for the best reasons. This is certainly a challenge that requires further thought. So, thank you very much. Finally, I like to refer to two recent publications where you can find out more about our results. And now I'm looking forward to the discussion.